I want to tell you about one very interesting and controversial case. It is about Hans Münch, a physician and biologist who lived from 1911 to 2001. You know, shortly before his death, Münch suddenly began to speak publicly in the spirit of Nazi ideology. It was a real shock. Imagine, a man who for years had been called the good man from Auschwitz suddenly spoke like a hardened Nazi. What surprised me most was the public reaction. Münch was not condemned, writing it all off as senile dementia. They said the old man was out of his mind. What can you take from him? True, in France he was convicted in absentia, but without any real consequences for the former SS man. But you know what the most interesting thing? These statements made many people think, was Hans Münch really so kind? And was he justly acquitted in 1947? Friends, subscribe to the channel in front of a lot of interesting things. Imagine a young, ambitious medical student in 1930s Germany. That's what Hans Münch was. While still studying at the University of Tübingen and Munich, he immersed himself in Nazi ideology. Not just sympathized, but actively participated in the National Socialist Students' Union and the Mechanized Corps. After receiving his diploma in 1937, Münch immediately joined the NSDAP. Can you imagine how quickly he joined the system? And 2 years later, in 1939, he defended his doctorate and got married. It would seem a perfect time to start a quiet career somewhere in Bavaria. But here's the interesting thing. When the war broke out, Münch was eager to volunteer at the front. Can you imagine? A man with a PhD in biology wanted to go into the trenches, but he was turned down. Apparently, the Nazi leadership believed that such specialists are more needed in the rear than on the front line. Imagine, June 1943. Nazi Germany is no longer the same as before. Behind Moscow, Stalingrad on the horizon looms the Battle of Kursk, and that's when Münch is finally allowed to join the SS. Funny, isn't it? He explained it in court by meeting an old friend in a high position. Apparently, connections decide everything, even in the SS. But here's the interesting thing. Instead of the front, Münch was sent to the Reiskow Hygiene Institute near Auschwitz, right in his specialty, you might say. And do you know who his colleague was? Dr. Death himself, Joseph Mengele. Can you imagine this couple? Both from Bavaria, the same age, both in the SS, but their fates after the war were different. Münch lived to the age of 90 in Germany, acquitted and free, and Mengele fled to Brazil, persecuted as a criminal with thousands of lives on his conscience. You know what the most amazing thing is? Mengele got to Auschwitz only 3 weeks before Münch, but those 3 weeks seem to define everything. Mengele did gruesome experiments on living human beings, sending them to their deaths without hesitation, and Münch, well, his role was not so clear-cut, and it makes you wonder about the fine line between complicity and non-participation in crimes of this magnitude. Münch worked in a laboratory studying malaria, rheumatism, and other diseases. Unlike his colleagues, he tried to stay away from the sorting of prisoners, that gruesome procedure that determined who would live and who would die. I avoided this work, citing the narrow profile of my specialty, he said. I was rarely in the camp itself, mostly in the laboratory. But here's the interesting thing. Münch also conducted experiments on prisoners. He deliberately infected people with dangerous diseases to study how their bodies reacted. However, and this is the key point, he tried to keep his subjects alive, stretching out the research, making sure the infected didn't die. For this, Münch earned the nickname the Good Man from Auschwitz. Many former prisoners even said, "To this man I owe my life." But let's think about it. Can a man who deliberately infected people with deadly diseases, even if he tried to keep them alive, be called kind? This is a complex question that shows how blurred the boundaries of morality can be in inhuman conditions. But now the war is over and the good man from Auschwitz is suddenly a fugitive. Yes, Hans Münch was in hiding, fearing retribution for his Nazi past. But fate had it differently. He was identified, caught, and in 1946 sent to Poland for trial. And this is where the most interesting part begins. At the first Auschwitz trial in Krakow, Münch found himself in the company of 39 other defendants. But you know what? He was the only one to be completely acquitted. Can you imagine? Former concentration camp inmates spoke in his defense, and the court decided this SS man was not a criminal. After his acquittal, Münch returned to Germany with his head held high. Now he could quietly practice medicine, without hiding and without looking back. Society accepted him. The past was kind of erased, but the story didn't end there. In 1964, imagine, Münch was back in the courtroom. Only now not as a defendant, but as a witness and expert at the second Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt am Main. He told the judges about the gruesome experiments of his former colleagues. In the late 1990s, when Hans Münch was already in his 80s, the public was shocked by a series of public statements supporting Nazi ideology. Münch suddenly began praising the infamous Dr. Death, Josef Mengele, calling him the most sympathetic and wonderful of all colleagues and comrades in his life. The statement sparked a wave of outrage given Mengele's reputation as one of the most brutal Nazi criminals. Even more disturbing was Münch's admission of involvement in the selection of prisoners for experiments on rheumatism. He cynically remarked, "I was able to conduct experiments there that otherwise could only be done on rabbits." These words horrified many, recalling the inhumane medical experiments of the Nazis. Münch was also not shy about expressing ideas about racial superiority. Münch's relatives tried to explain his shocking statements with Alzheimer's disease, claiming that he could not be held responsible for his words. However, the disease also affects the brain's capacity for self-control, which can lead a person to openly express thoughts and beliefs that he or she had previously suppressed and concealed. In recent years, the case of Hans Münch, known as the good man from Auschwitz, has taken an unexpected turn. Polish authorities decided to review the records of his post-war trial, and the results of that investigation have been disappointing for the former Nazi doctor's reputation. The new investigation revealed that most of the witnesses who testified in Münch's favor had never actually been his patients. Their testimony was based only on rumors about the good Dr. Eiberlit that circulated in the camp. These stories created an image of a doctor who behaved more humanely than other Nazis. Experts attributed the behavior of these witnesses to the Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon in which victims begin to justify their torturers if they showed even the slightest signs of humanity. In a concentration camp, where cruelty was the norm, even a minimal show of sympathy could be perceived as an act of extraordinary kindness. While these proceedings were underway, however, Hans Münch himself had reached an advanced age. By the age of 90, his physical and mental condition had deteriorated significantly, and he died, making it impossible for him to participate in new trials or to testify. Friends, here is such a video, and what you think about it, write in the comments.